The U.S. is now threatening to abandon peace talks and possibly Ukraine entirely if they don't come to a peace deal in the next couple days. Is the president losing patience with everyone, or has he finally woken up to the reality that Russia simply can't be trusted? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a crazy story that it has the hallmarks of President Trump, right? While the average diplomat just seems to have patience, right? If you've ever done diplomacy, if you've ever done any kind of negotiations between big entities, you know that they just don't move fast. The bigger the entity, right? A large corporation, a government, a state, or in this case, two nuclear powers, they just don't do things quick. Right? They have to think about things. They do analysis. They offer and counteroffer. So when you see this sort of, you have just a few days to make a choice, that tends to be the characteristic of President Trump, who has very little patience. And in some ways, I think that's good. I think a sense of urgency is useful in negotiations, right? You would be shocked. It's just like, governments are in some ways like us in that unless faced with a crisis, you'll go to the grocery store tomorrow until the food runs out. And then you go, oh man, if I want to eat today, if I want to eat lunch, I got to go to the grocery store. So sometimes that can be a useful tool. But the problem with timelines is that everybody gets on the timeline, right? And so if you want to make a good, thorough, and complete grocery list, you can't do both that and also grocery shop at the last possible minute, right? So the U.S. is out here saying we're going to abandon these peace efforts within days if no progress is made. And what'll happen is likely Russia and Vladimir Putin, who's a master at stringing the U.S. along, will make a bunch of promises and reassurances that conveniently involve no meaningful concrete actions from the Russian side. And Russia will either take meaningless good faith actions or literally nothing at all. And of course, the Americans will pretend like this is real good faith efforts. And will be unable to distinguish stalling tactics from real good faith actions. So Marco Rubio said, quote, "If it's not possible to end the war in Ukraine, we need to move on," he told reporters before departing for Paris, where high-level talks with European and Ukrainian officials. He continued, quote, "We need to determine very quickly now, I'm talking a matter of days, whether or not this is doable," right? And of course, you might remember this is a problem because Trump had promised that he was going to end the war first within 24 hours of being elected. That obviously didn't happen. And now, within just a few, really just a couple of, I think 100 days was his goal. Well, that has come and went. So it's, again, he's learning what the rest of us have known for 3 years, which is that Russia is committed to this war. They're committed to winning this war. They see it as an opportunity to humiliate, not just bring Ukraine, a defeated Ukraine, into sort of the Russian sphere of orbit and turn them into Belarus, Belarus 2, if you like, but also to humiliate NATO, to make NATO look impotent and ineffectual. And in that goal, Russia appears to be succeeding, right? And remember, Putin was willing to fight when his troops were being forced out of Kharkiv, out of Kherson, when he lost the Battle of Kiev, and he was still willing to put the fight to them, even as the U.S. was backing Ukraine with almost limitless funds, though it wasn't really limitless. It was, again, I think an average of about about 3% of the U.S. defense spending in a given year was sent to Ukraine. Not exactly a blank check, so to speak. But again, the U.S. Really just, Putin was willing to continue that fight, so he's definitely going to continue now that the West and Western alliance is looking fractured, that the U.S. has said they're not going to support Ukraine. Again, this doesn't make any sense from a negotiation perspective. Right? If there's no movement, according to one U.S. official, the administration will have to make significant policy decisions, which could mean literally anything, though probably Trump just simply ignoring the problem and moving on to the next thing. That seems to, again, be the administration's policy. Trump has threatened sanctions and tariffs on Russia, but he's also said the U.S. wouldn't continue to fund Ukraine indefinitely, which means that basically, if negotiations were to stop, Ukraine would be screwed. Would be much worse off. So again, for Russia, there's actually an incentive to do no deal, because no deal looks better for them than doing a deal. And Ukraine has repeatedly said they're open to ceasefires. They're open to partial ceasefires. They're willing to sign a minerals deal. They're willing to do a bunch of different stuff. But it's like the Russians are the ones who have repeatedly made empty promises, claimed they were going to do X and Y and Z. They've reneged on promises. They've said no to ceasefires. They've added conditions that are just absurd. Like, we can't do a deal with Zelensky. He's not the legitimate ruler of Ukraine. We can't sign a ceasefire until Ukraine stops recruiting troops. Like, just completely ridiculous things that only work that only make sense if you're planning on just violating the ceasefire and you want your opponent to be somehow weakened by a ceasefire. Now, before we talk a little bit about why even the Russians think this is really not going anywhere, I want to mention that it seems like the U.S. leadership, right, just can't seem to focus. It's almost like they're cognitively struggling to keep a singular idea together, to really be able to mentalize the Russian positions, and to do so over a period of weeks or months or even years. And that can feel like, well, you and I, right? You get it. We work, you're trying to parent, you're trying to work out, you're trying to juggle everything. It can take a lot. And so you need every little edge you can get to keep your cognition sharp. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to point out today's sponsor is actually this company, Magic Mind. And Magic Mind is, they're actually made in Venice Beach, California. They're for lack of a better term, an energy shot, but not like a regular energy shot, right? They're actually only contain about 55 milligrams of caffeine, which is about half a cup of coffee. So just a little bit of a caffeine pop. But what's really cool is that the rest of it, I sort of assumed when they sent me these, that these were going to have like 2 natural ingredients, and then it was going to have like 50 chemicals in it that to make it like shelf stable and stuff. No, in fact, the ingredients are all natural, right? Matcha green tea, agave, olive oil, passion fruit, ashwagandha, cordyceps mushrooms. And it really is just a bunch of natural stuff put together in these great shots. And each little shot is just 25 calories, has almost no sodium, which is important to me. But it's got 100 milligrams or 100% of your daily value of vitamin C, vitamin D3, B12, niacin. It's really packed with a lot of good stuff. And again, it's got the cordyceps, which a lot of people are super hot now, right? They talk about them as a nootropic or an adaptogen, something to really improve your cognition. So if you're interested, Magic Mind's got a promo code that's 50% off. There should be a QR code that I'm going to totally put on the screen when I edit this video. And then there's a link in the description that'll take you to the same. And also, if you want a additional discount, you can get it as a subscription, and you can literally just sign up for the subscription and then cancel after the first one and get the discount, right? Like, and if you like it, keep the subscription. Duh. So yeah, check it out. Thanks again to Magic Mind for being a sponsor. They're linked in the description. Okay. Now, let's take a look. I really want to point out some other stuff. One is that the U.S. and Ukraine say they've inked a minerals deal, but there's a problem. The actual terms of the minerals deal, this isn't a deal that says anything, which I just love. It's just so quintessential. It's so emblematic of how this administration seems to do everything, right? And again, this is the minerals deal, but it's a memorandum of intent, right? So this is just stating, here's a written version of what I plan on doing later, right? And it's the same thing as we saw in the first minerals deal. It's a plan. It says, hey, later on, we should talk about this. Look, just join me in reading this. Let's see if we can just zoom in just a little bit. Let's try to get a little bit more we can see of this. Yeah. Okay. One, all these whereases are just saying, here's some things that happened. One, the United States provided financial and material support to Ukraine. The American people want to invest in the Ukrainian people in a free, sovereign, and secure Ukraine. The United States and Ukraine want a lasting peace and a durable partnership. U.S. and Ukraine recognize that Ukraine strengthened international peace and security by voluntarily relinquishing the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, thereby making them vulnerable to invasion. And the two guarantors of their sovereignty are the United States and Russia. Obviously, Russia is violating their sovereignty. And Ukraine just wanted to remind everyone of that obligation that the U.S. has, right? And it says the U.S. and Ukraine want to establish a reconstruction investment fund as part of an economic partnership between our governments, right? And then it says we had highly productive technical discussions, and then it gave the dates that they happened. Why is that necessary? I don't know. To finalize negotiation of an establishment of a reconstruction investment fund. The U.S. respects Ukraine's intention. By the way, there's a spelling error. There's no apostrophe here, which is funny. Ukraine's intention to avoid conflicts in the drafting of the agreement with Ukraine's obligations under the European Union accession agreements with international financial institutions and other creditors. And what that means is they say that one of the conflicts in this minerals deal said that to become a member of the EU, something the EU has said, we want Ukraine to become an EU member because we've established these huge partnerships already. But to do so, you have to promise essentially that certain key markets are going to be free, or they have to meet certain standards for being free. Because you have to think, like, let's say the Ukrainians, or let's pick another EU country. Let's say the French. The French came in and said, actually, we are going to give massive subsidies to our wine industry so that we're going to make it so cheap to grow French wine that it's going to be 50 cents a bottle for the best French wine in the world. And every other European country that grows wine would say, well, hey, man, what the fuck? That's not a free market, right? And so the EU has these rules that say, listen, if you want to join, your markets have to be free-ish. And it cuts both ways. You can't subsidize it so that the consumer loses, but you also can't have firms lose either, right? Again, if, for example, a French wine company was to say, we actually want to plant some vineyards, some grapes in German wine regions. And if Germany was to say, well, actually, we have this agreement that says that only this one German company is allowed to grow grapes here. Well, the French would go, well, wait, we're EU members. We're supposed to have cross-border trade. You won't let us invest in your wine region because you have an exclusive contract to some other company forever? That's unfair. That's not competitive free markets. And so the EU has all these rules, and handing over Ukrainian minerals en masse to U.S. companies would violate those rules. So the Ukrainians are like, hey, you got to put it in here, right? And then all they say, the last two paragraphs, just say that we're going to visit and we're going to lend high-level support to the conclusion of technical discussions on the terms of an agreement establishing a reconstruction investment fund. So again, the minerals deal is just a thing that says, we're going to talk about it, we're going to sort it out later. And we're going to it literally says, we're going to finalize the necessary documents and economic partnership establishing the investment fund in a future meeting. So it's a deal. This is less of a minerals deal and more of a document that says we should do a minerals deal sometime, right? It's like texting your friend and being like, we should grab a beer, right? And your friend goes, yeah, I would love to grab a beer with you sometime. You're like, that's not a plan. You haven't planned to grab a beer. You've planned to grab a beer. You've planned to come up with a plan to grab a beer in the future. So you see how this is to me just like, again, everywhere you look, when you dig into how this administration negotiates, like, and you know, right? I don't need to establish on this channel that I had grave problems with the choices that the previous White House made in Ukraine about their policies. I thought they were spineless, were unwilling to stand up. I thought they were letting Russia lead the dance so that Russia never actually felt pressured. But this is like the opposite problem, right? the previous administration was paralyzed, unable to take a real stance. This administration loves taking stances. They're hard charging, but they have no idea what direction they're going, right? The previous administration never even pulled their car out of the driveway, it felt like. This administration is like driving over my neighbor's lawns. They're doing everything but taking a route to a destination, right? And again, unfortunately, one of them seems to be worse. And this is, I mean, in the minerals deal, it's sort of funny, right? It's kind of funny. But to be like, you guys didn't make a deal, so we're going home. And it's like, do you not see how you're driving away from the place you're trying to go? The place you're trying to go is a ceasefire, is a peace deal, right? And if you stop supporting Ukraine and you stop sanctioning Russia, you're favoring the Russian outcome. You're giving Russia a win, which in turn means that Russia made the best call. The best decision Russia could make is not to negotiate, right? Instead, if you understood incentives in a more holistic way, you would say, Russia, this is your last chance to get a real peace deal, ceasefire deal on the books, one in which we will accept you. And this is the last chance to recognize where we would recognize any of your claims on Ukraine, right? And Ukraine has said they're actually not opposed to some territorial concessions. So the U.S., if they were smart, they'd say, if we do not get to the end of April and you have not established a ceasefire deal and a peace framework with Ukraine, the U.S. is going to abandon all of its previous concessions. Ukraine NATO membership, we're going to pursue it. We're going to not just continue our aid to Ukraine, but we're going to ramp it up. We are going to increase sanctions. We are going to refuse to recognize any Russian territorial concessions. None of those things will be on the table. And our pivot will be towards ensuring either Russian defeat or complete destruction of the Russian economy, right? That is the kind of incentive that you have to put out. And again, the problem is that for the United States, right, you look most credible when you publicly disclose these things. Because if you were to say it in public, the Russians would go, damn, there's one thing President Trump doesn't want to be. It's a total liar, right? He doesn't want to look weak. And he said he's going to do these things. He said he's going to take a strong, tough stance. Now, he's been willing to say one thing one week and say a different thing the other week. So, and it's not clear that that's actually negatively affected the public's perception of him, but it looks more credible. Just like how people will believe you more if you tell all of your friends, you're like, I'm training for a marathon. I'm training for a marathon. I'm training for a marathon. It actually, people believe it more than if you just sort of think it to yourself and don't tell anybody, right? Because when you're only accountable to yourself, it's kind of easy to, but when you're accountable to everybody else and you've publicly said it, it looks like a stronger commitment. So, I think that would be a better sort of negotiating tactic. And the fact that they're not says that, again, the administration just can't get out of its own way. Now, I think this is really interesting because despite the U.S. trying to put this pressure on Russia, but not actually putting pressure on them, Russia, this is from April 11th of this year, by the way, 7 days ago, the Russians are saying, listen, there's no deal coming, right? Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said, quote, talks were a good opportunity to convey Russia's position to Trump, quote, but there's no need to expect any breakthroughs, right? Right. And Witkoff, being the special representative of President Trump, will bring something from his president for Putin. The conversation will continue on various aspects of the Ukrainian settlement. And so this, I think, illustrates the fact that the U.S. Is trying to put pressure on Russia, but is completely unable to do so. And again, or is unwilling. They have many, many tools to put additional pressure on Russia. But what's also interesting is that this article says no instructions from Putin as energy ceasefire ends. You might recall March 18th, there was agreement to an energy and infrastructure ceasefire. Neither side actually understood what had been agreed to. This is, again, just the President Trump, again, a weird diplomacy failure, as we talked about in each side released different transcripts of what they said they had agreed to. President Vladimir Putin's transcript said in the English translation on TASS that he had agreed to a ceasefire for energy infrastructure. The White House readout of the same call said that Putin had agreed to energy and infrastructure, right? So in the Russian reading, there was a promise that Russia wouldn't target, Russia would not be targeted, would not have its oil industry targeted. Ukraine, worth noting, has the only energy infrastructure that Ukraine has, the only energy industry, is coal industry in Pokrovsk, which was shut down not long ago. So there's limited energy infrastructure in Ukraine, and much more so in Russia. Whereas Ukraine has said, listen, I thought we were agreeing to energy and infrastructure. So you can't target things like our power generation stations or water treatment plants, even civilian residential buildings. I thought we had simply said no targeting civilian infrastructure. And so the fact that something even that simple, again, I think Russia deliberately misunderstood or misinterpreted. But the fact that the administration couldn't even understand they had to pin an agreement down, pin Russia down to an agreement is just kind of illustrative of the fact that this is pretty amateurish. Now, there's one other story that I thought, well, there's two other stories we got to talk about. But one I thought was really interesting because you see, I was searching I had read earlier about the Russia not expecting any breakthroughs, and I was trying to find that story again. But in the process, I actually found a different story. Look at the date on this. 21 January 2022. This was just a week and a half before Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, one of the narratives during the election that Trump pointed out was to say, hey, no one ever tried to make a deal with Putin. I could have made a deal. None of the Biden administration did. But you can see that actually Anthony Blinken was literally talking to Sergei Lavrov in high-level talks just days before the invasion. And in fact, what's fascinating is that you hear 3 years ago how different the Russian narrative sounded, right? And listen to some of the things here, right? U.S. and its allies remain resolute in rejecting Russia's most important demands. Blinken told Lavrov that the U.S. would present Russia with written responses to its proposals next week and suggested the two men would likely meet again shortly after that. But with 100,000 troops massed near the Ukraine border, many feel Moscow is preparing an invasion, even though Russia denies. They said they're not planning an invasion. This was 3 weeks before the invasion. U.S. and its allies scrambling to present a united front and coordinate a tough response if they can. We didn't expect any major breakthroughs to happen today, but I believe we're on a clear path to understanding each other's positions, Blinken told reporters. That's an incredibly, that's a way of saying, well, I know what this asshole's thinking, right? And Lavrov repeatedly insisted that Russia has no plans to invade Ukraine. But the U.S. says you're definitely planning on invading Ukraine. Looks like the U.S. was right, and Russia were untrustworthy liars. And of course, Blinken said, well, if Russia isn't planning on invading Ukraine, then remove your troops from Ukraine's border. And of course, the U.S. agreed to provide written responses to Russian demands on Ukraine and NATO. Remember that two of Russia's demands were actually that the NATO alliance promised that Ukraine never be allowed to join, and it wants allies to remove troops and military equipment from parts of Eastern Europe. Now, here's the funny thing. Both of those things have happened under President Trump. President Trump has said, I will reject any Ukrainian NATO membership, and he's said he's going to withdraw at least U.S. troops from the Baltics, and yet Moscow has no interest in peace. That should tell you that these demands were also lies, because Russia has gotten them now, and they continue to pursue their war. So we can see that Russia, from day one, really even before day one, has been just willing to lie through their teeth about the state and their intentions, right? Their intentions cannot be discerned through words. They are not a country to negotiate with. Instead, they exploit electoral systems, especially this one, in which, as we've talked about, when you have an administration that gets a large portion of its information about international relations from social media, they end up in this environment where they think that the Twitter version of the truth is the whole truth, right? Look how often they said they never, the U.S. never tried to make a deal. They never tried to negotiate with Russia. But we just saw that they did weeks before. They sent the national security advisor to literally meet personally with Lavrov, and Lavrov met with him. And they walked away, and Russia said, oh, we're not even planning on invading Ukraine. And so you see after that why the U.S. and the Biden administration said, listen, we're done talking to Russia because we gave you a chance to express your concerns. And we said, we'll hear them out. We'll give you formal responses. We just got to talk to our people, right? And so the U.S. said, we'll try this. We'll try diplomacy. We're here to try to get you to think things through. And so it was obvious that the Russians had no intention of engaging in diplomacy. And the Trump White House believed the social media version, right? The 30-second, the 100-character tweet version, which is you could have made a deal, but you didn't, right? You didn't do anything, which is true, right? The U.S. couldn't take any concrete actions until Russia invaded because Russia insisted that it wasn't going to invade, and they were like, we can't pre-crime Russia. But when you only consume Twitter news and you don't get any context, if you only consume sound bites, you end up believing that that's the whole story and that the other party is just dumb, that the other party and every other administration that has negotiated with Russia and come to the same conclusion, that Russia doesn't tell the truth, that Russia uses negotiations as a stalling tactic, that what they say and their actions have no correlation. So many administrations come to this conclusion, but only after years and after Russia takes advantage of that, another administration coming in, believing they can do a reset, believing that Russia is honest and just a misunderstood friend, right? And it's almost like Russia is like a poorly trained dog that bites everyone. And every 4 years, a new person moves in to the neighborhood and says, I'm good with dogs. The other people, there's so many bad dog owners. They just don't understand. Fluffy just needs this treatment or that treatment, or I need to train him this way or that way. And every single one of them naively walks into the pen with their version of treats or rewards or commands or whatever the hot thing is. And then the dog bites them. And they come to the conclusion, this is just a dangerous dog. But then 3 years later, somebody new comes in who read a new book about dog training, right? And at some point, right, you have to sit there and be like, listen, this dog isn't going to be fixed. We can't train this behavior out of the dog. The dog has to be contained, right? And that's the conclusion that the West simply cannot bring itself to reach in Russia, because it would require actual material effort. It would require, the U.S. to sacrifice 3% of its defense budget, not of the whole budget, 3% of its defense budget to keep Russia, to really defeat Russia. Maybe that number would even have to be 6%. So I just the level of naivete, I just remain in awe of it. But that's not the only aspect of troubling levels of naivete, right? And let's see if I can find this here. Let's see. The administration has developed this very troubling policy, I'm going to say, of ignoring the U.S. Supreme Court. And we got to talk about it because it's a big fucking problem. I don't know how else to tell you this, right? So you guys might have known there's a story. I haven't really covered it on this channel that much, where a person who entered the U.S. illegally, right, was in the U.S. and basically got put through the deportation process, right? This is pretty standard stuff. There's millions of people in the U.S. who entered the border. Again, it is actually not accurate to say they entered illegally, because there are ways you can show up on the U.S. border without a pre-existing pre-approved visa and still get in. You have to use the asylum process. Sounds like this guy did, right? Like everybody else. Shows up, makes an asylum claim, enters the U.S., and then it works its way through the courts, right? And by the way, this isn't me being like some lefty talking point speculator. I spent 7 years in the Department of Homeland Security. In fact, I think it's right there. It's my award from the DHS Council of Inspectors General for my work. So I spent a long time there. I do know immigration like pretty inside and out. So this guy goes through the asylum process, right? And makes his case, and ultimately a judge says, listen, you're going to be deported, but we promise we won't deport you to El Salvador, your country of origin, because in El Salvador, the police are engaged in a massive crackdown on what they believe is gang violence. And in the process, though, almost every military-age male, or actually I thought the latest stat was about 30% of military-age males get detained by the police for some time. And they are often, very often, put in prisons extrajudicially, right? There are no charges. They're essentially running the country in a state of emergency. And I have sympathy for El Salvador because they're a failed state, right? And it's almost unheard of for a country to go from being a failed state to a full due process democracy, right? Sometimes a government has to just assert control. But this guy said, listen, the government is going to fuck me up. The gangs are going to kill me, right? If you send me back to El Salvador. And he presented enough evidence that a judge said, yeah, I think you're right, dude. I think these gangs will kill you if we send you back to El Salvador. So we're going to find another country to deport you to, and we'll send you there. And so that's what the court said, right? And the problem is that the administration detained this guy. Mark said, hey, you got a deportation order, we're deporting you. We don't give it. And he said, and his lawyer said, yo, listen, you can't deport him to El Salvador. And the administration said, yeah, we are. And they sent him to El Salvador. Here's the problem. The problem is that the courts came back and they said, yo, government, you deported this guy in error. The government's own lawyers said, yeah, we deported this guy in error. It was a mistake. We should not have deported him. And the government said, well, but now he's deported, fuck him. Let him rot in El Salvador. And this has been appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I have here the actual ruling of the Supreme Court of the United States, ruling in this injunction. And what they said, and this is a 9-0 ruling. So every single Supreme Court justice, including Trump's 3 appointees, agreed with this statement, which they said they removed the man, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, from the United States to El Salvador, where he's currently detained in what El Salvador calls its Center for Terrorism Confinement. United States, the U.S.'s own attorneys acknowledged that he was subject to a withholding order forbidding his removal to El Salvador, and that the removal to El Salvador was therefore illegal. So the government says we did an illegal thing, right? The U.S. says it was a result of an administrative error. The United States, however, alleges that Abrego Garcia has been found to be a member of the gang MS-13, a designated foreign terrorist organization, and that his return to the United States would pose a threat to the public. Abrego Garcia's own lawyers say he's not a member of MS-13, that he's lived safely in the United States with his family for a decade and has never been charged with a crime. Now, what happened? The answer is the district court said, you got to bring this guy back. You have to facilitate and effectuate his return to the United States by April 7th. And the U.S. government appealed up to the Supreme Court, said, we don't have to do shit. Now the Supreme Court came down and they said that no, the government has to facilitate his release from custody. And what they said is the district court, listen, we can't tell the executive branch how to do international relations, but we can tell you that you have to get this guy back because you didn't let him get his due process. The court said, these are the rules under due process. We have ruled that he's entitled to this thing, not being deported to El Salvador. You told the courts to fuck off. We're going to deport you to El Salvador. And now, it doesn't matter what the courts say, he's stuck there. So the thing that worries me That is so troubling. And here is actually because the government has said, we're not going to do shit. Like, all it means is that if he can somehow get out of the terrorist confinement center and somehow get back to the United States, we have to let him in. And the courts have said that's not what facilitate means. That what you have to do is actually get this guy back. And this is an appeals court, right? The Supreme Court, generally the way it works is Supreme Court says, okay, here's there's two sides to this debate about what to do. Here's what we're saying has to happen. They give it to a lower court and say, it's on you to actually execute on this decision. And this is what that judge has ruled, right? He's said, this is from his ruling, it's difficult to get to the hard matter, but in this case, it's not hard at all. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. It's claimed that in essence, because the government has rid itself of custody, that there's nothing that can be done. This is shocking not only to judges, but to our intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear, right? And right, the government asserts, as he points out, that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13, perhaps or perhaps not, but he's still entitled to due process. If the government's so confident in its position, it should be assured that it will prevail in the proceedings to terminate the removal order. Right? And the government argues that Abrego Garcia was mistakenly deported, so why does it not want to make what was wrong right? And this is the fundamental, a really troubling problem. Not because one dude, whether he's one El Salvadorian, whether he's in the United States or not, is going to be of national import. What's of national import is the fact that if he's really an MS-13 member, one, it would cost the government virtually nothing to bring him back, have this last hearing where they say, hey, we want to vacate this order. Here, we're going to roll out the evidence that he's a member of a terrorist organization, and then we're going to deport him. Because if you're a terrorist, get out of this country. That's not controversial. The problem is they're committed to telling the justices, the justice system, the court system, you know what? We're not really interested in what you say we have to do. You say we have to follow this rule and this rule. You write all these injunctions. We're not interested in following them anymore. We don't want to follow them. And the problem is once the executive branch says, yeah, you courts, you can say whatever you want. We're going to do what we please anyway. Once you establish that, all the rest of it can get washed out the window. That's the problem. Supreme Court says, bring this guy back. There is no higher level of appeal. Supreme Court said, you must facilitate his return. We're not going to tell you how, but you got to get him back. Right? And the administration says, we're not doing shit. And so this is what is so troubling. This is why it is really worrying. And it's so important that, again, I'm covering it despite being a little off topic. It's because who else does the administration and the government, remember, because once the government has this power, it's not just going to be this administration that has it. What if an extremist with different beliefs takes office next administration and they have this same power to ignore court orders, to say the courts say a lot of shit, but fuck them, right? What if the government simply asserts, hey, we got this person, they're not a citizen of the United States. And the court says, yeah, they are. You gotta give him a chance. Put him in here. He's got to have his due process. And the government goes, no, we promise he's a terrorist. We Guantanamo Bay'd him. We swear. And the court says, you got to prove it to us. And they go, no, you don't. Right? What happens when anyone else when the executive gets to decide with no burden of proof that someone's a terrorist or a gang member, right? Like, what happens when if you were someone, for example, who donated to Ukraine, right? What happens when they decide, I think everybody that supported Ukraine, I think they're terrorists. I think they worked against the interests of the United States, right? They supported Ukraine, who the administration considers in some ways an enemy. Well, right, if Russia's a friend, then Ukraine must be an enemy. What happens when they sit there and they say, actually, we think you're a terrorist and we're going to deport you to El Salvador? You go, well, I'm a citizen. The courts won't allow this. Guys, once they don't have to listen to courts, you got no option. There's no recourse. You can't sit there and be like, well, this is illegal. if the courts can't tell them that. This is like fundamental to how the government works. It is one of the reasons that we have a president, not a king, right? Because there are three branches of government. They're all co-equal. There is no government there's no person in charge of the government. The Supreme Court sits atop the judicial branch of our government. The House and Senate, Congress sits atop our legislative branch of government, and the president sits atop our executive branch of government. But they're all equal, and they all keep each other in check. That's the whole point of the system. And so once an administration says, actually, the judicial branch is only symbolic, or we can trump them at any time for any reason that we want, you have diminished the rule of law for everyone. Because here's the thing. If they prove that they are willing to deport anyone without due process, then it tells everyone else, hey, listen, right? Look at look at all those green card holders that they say, well, if you protest the wrong country, we're going to pull your green card. Well, now you don't have to pull everyone else's green card. You've already, if you do it for a couple people, you've stopped everyone else with a green card from protesting. So you see how, and just like if you say, listen, we just told a couple of people, we said, listen, we know you have a piece of paper from a judge that says you can stay here, but we just want everyone else to know that that piece of paper doesn't mean anything to us. Then you'll have effectively taken away rights or taken away a willingness you've effectively taken that away from everyone. Just some stuff to think about. I'm going to keep you guys posted, but this is really troubling. Like, again, if remember nothing else, the Supreme Court has said 9-0, bring this dude back. And the administration has said, we're not doing shit. Which means every other Supreme Court ruling that gets made from here on out is worth nothing. It's toilet paper. It's no better than if you and I wrote, please don't do that on a piece of paper and fucking mailed it to the White House. And that should trouble everybody. Because again, today, it's these guys. Tomorrow, could be somebody else. Next administration, different worldview. They might believe something totally different. And again, you can't just nuke an entire branch of government out of relevance. It's not how it works. Anyway, hit that subscribe button. Huge thank you to all our Colonel tier members like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Cortes, Dan M, and Ida Skycall. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.